Hello, welcome to Cozy Costume Creations. I'm Sarah Beth. Today I'm going to teach you a few kind of trimming techniques. So we're going to learn what trimming is, you're going to learn what grading a seam is, and then you're going to learn what clips and notches are. There are two types of notches. One is a type of notch when when you have a pattern and you're trying to match two pieces together. That's a notch, but this is like the trimming notch. So there are two notches in sewing. So this is when they say like notch the seam allowance. This is what this is. So let's do it. All right, so I have just a few little samples I've sewn up to demonstrate this. So we'll first do a corner. So when you are told to trim a corner, you're usually trimming it down to about 1/4 of an inch. So that just means cut away the seam allowance. The seam allowance is usually a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So trimming means that you're going to cut it down to about 1/4 of an inch. It might tell you less, maybe 1/8, but usually not less than that. Now the reason for trimming is because if I have this one where I haven't trimmed it down, and then I try to turn this inside out on this seam, I just wind up with a lot of bulk on the inside, right? So I have a lot of bulk, so that's why we trim it down, right? So I'm not going to have it be as bulky when I turn this inside out. So I turn this inside out. Now we run into a problem though, because I haven't clipped my corners, which is the next technique. And so this corner, it has all of this extra fabric inside it that's sitting in there. In my classes, I would pass this around and you'd be able to feel like there's so much bulk, right? The reason is because you have all of this fabric and then it's going in on itself. So it's becoming really bulky when you turn it inside out. So to reduce that, what we do for corners is we clip this way first, and then you kind of clip in and clip in. So we wind up with something like this. Now when I turn these inside out, you see how the seam is going to just like, now that it's opened up, when they're flipped inside out, they're going to kind of like turn in on each other, and there's not going to be like a large amount of space in between. That's maybe a little confusing, but basically as I'm turning this inside out, do you see how little bulk there is now there, right? There's not a ton of fabric inside that's holding it. So now these are folding into each other, and then I can use something called a point turner, this tool, to kind of poke out my corner so I can get a really beautiful, nice corner that then I would press really nicely. And I have this lovely corner, right? And if we look, we can kind of see what's happening underneath, and I can feel it where, oh yeah, you can definitely see it a little bit. You see how like the edge of this fabric ends here on the inside, and then this one ends here, so that there's a little bit of space in between. Sometimes you can get it exactly so that they just touch, and that's absolutely sublime. This is pretty good though. So now I have this reduced bulk in here, so I can get this beautiful corner, and I get this lovely point, right? So that's why we do that. There you go, reduction of bulk. Now I have some curves that I drew. So we have a curve going this way and one going this way, and they need opposite things, because when I try to turn this inside out, this one I have excess fabric, right? It's that same thing we saw with the corner where there's all of this extra fabric in there that's folding up in on itself. You see that, how it's folding in and it's creating so much bulk. Now I have the opposite problem on this side where I can't fully push this out, because if I try to get this curve to sit the way I want it to, it's being pulled back. So this one needs fabric cut out because it's got too much. This one needs fabric released so that it can spread, right? So this is the difference between clipping and notching. We're going to do notches on this one and clips on this one. So looking at this one on the inside, whoop, this one right here. Yeah, do you see that pull, that tension? It's pulling, it's not able to curve around the way that it's supposed to. And on the inside of this, on this one, let me see. On the inside of this one, you see that there's all this seam allowance that's kind of keeping it from spreading out the way it needs to. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to trim these down, so that's going to reduce the bulk inside there too, right? So let's trim it to about 1/4. I guess I went to 1/8 in some places, but you know, this is just a demo. All right, now I need to reduce the bulk on this one, so I am going to do notches. Notches are just little triangles that go to the seam and not past it. And you do as many as you need to make it so that the seam will eventually sit kind of flat, right? This is a pretty tiny curve. You're not usually gonna be using such a tiny curve. So this is really tiny, and my notches are really tiny to follow that. But here we go. All right, so we have this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this inside out. And now it's less bulky, right? So again, I wish I could hand this around and let you touch it. But you can see how the seam allowance in here, you can kind of see what's happening where we just have these little notches that are cut out, right? So we have a little notch cut out here and a little notch cut out here. And that makes it so that instead of having just this thick layer, it can kind of bend in on itself, right? So it's bending in, and so we're able to have the shape happen much nicer, right? So I've cut those notches out. Beautiful, 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 right? Reduction of bulk. That was the goal here. And that makes it so that it sits flat. Lovely, lovely, lovely. We'd probably use our point turner, do some nice things to it, and then iron it, right? Now, this guy, you can really see, is just too tight. I'm going to try to go and do this thing, and it's pulling on this side. There's too much tension here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to clip. And the goal of clipping is to release the tension. So I'm going to release that tension and make it so that when I flip this the other way, this can spread, right? So it's not pulled in by the seam allowance. Now it can spread out beautifully. Now let's flip this one. And now, do you see how that tension has pretty much disappeared? I'm going to iron it just so it's a little clearer. But now we have triangles now, but not because we cut out triangles, but because we needed to cut a straight line to release the tension so that now that it's flipped, it's creating that extra space. So it creates a triangle now, but for a different reason, right? And we can see that the tension on this point is really released, and it's sitting pretty flat, which is awesome. So there you go. That's the trimming, notches, clips, all the things. Now let's talk about grading a seam. Grading a seam is where you cut at usually about like a 45-degree angle. So instead of cutting like this to trim my edge, I'm going to cut kind of angled. And what this does is this staggers my seam allowance. Right? So this is staggered, right? This bottom layer is longer, and then the top one is the shortest. Here's like a great point where you can really see that, right? So I have this seam. This one is longer, this one's slightly shorter, the shortest, right? So it's something that is kind of graded, right? We're creating kind of this angle instead of having this thick bulk of all of these layers sitting on top, right? So you see how this is also a technique that reduces bulk in a very slow, nice, gradual way. So you'll see this technique on collars a lot. You don't usually see it on a technique where there's just two pieces of fabric sewn together. Usually it's at least 3, and typically like 4+ pieces of fabric that are sewn together that you use this technique on, because it is to reduce bulk. You don't really need to reduce too much bulk when there's just 2 pieces of fabric. But when you have so much thickness, that's when you want to do it. So there you go. I hope you learned something. I hope you had fun, and see you later.